Before the 1600s, the Dutch skippers only knew of one safe way to trade with Western Africa. They would anchor offshore and lower the lifeboats. The reason was that the entire coast was solidly in the hands of the Portuguese, who did everything in their power to set up the black population against these invaders from the Low Countries. But where the Dutch smelled merchandise, they couldn't be stopped, and so they traded in secret. The first Dutch attempt to go ashore in full view became a downright disaster. The only things surviving the ordeal were some of the Dutchmen's clothes, which a year later were offered for sale to a Portuguese captain by natives who proudly boasted of having chopped off the heads of all 35 trespassers without mercy. That was an unfortunate start. The Cape Verdean Islands, 300 miles off the coast, had always served as a gateway to the treasures of the African mainland. When the Portuguese landed there in the 15th century, they were uninhabited. But as their strategic value was obvious, they at once started building a gigantic fortress. Of the 10 islands, Santiago, Ilha do Sal, and São Vicente were most important to the Portuguese. This is their old capital, where the stones of the cathedral, battered by time and the elements, are now being used to mend the roads. Of this once so majestic cathedral, only part of the facade is still standing, a symbol of lost glory, built, as were the fortresses, by slaves who were imported on a massive scale by the Portuguese to do hard labor. The other surviving object is a whipping post, another symbol of the basic elements of those heydays, the blood, sweat, and tears of the slaves.
Cesar de que mantré por ti ses outros dois perdem a luz, perdem a fé.
I'd rather lose my faith than my lover, the Cape Verdean fado goes. 5 centuries of Portuguese rule and the importation of slaves have provided the Cape Verdean Islands with a mixed Afro-Portuguese population with a very strong Portuguese element.
perder a luz, perder minha fé.
In these same 5 centuries, the tree has become a curiosity here, even though these islands were once called the Green Cape. Overcropping and desert winds from the Sahel have resulted in disastrous erosion and drought here. Every day, great amounts of seawater are pumped up a valley on an island with the appropriate name of Ilha do Sal, Salt Island. The water would flow in and out of the salt pans on the natural rhythm of the tide, so that the salt was always available. Especially for the herring fishers, the Dutch shipped out loads of salt from these regions until the Spanish-Portuguese alliance put an end to this in 1580, during the Dutch-Spanish War. From then on, the salt skippers had to cross the ocean all the way to Venezuela to obtain this white gold. Of all the Cape Verdean islands, São Vicente has the most beautiful natural harbour. With mountain ranges on either side and the island of São Antão opposite, we find the town of Mindelo, still the centre of trade for the Cape Verdeans. São Vicente served as a rallying point for Dutch ships in case the fleet had been scattered for one reason or another. From here, they would continue their voyage to Brazil, South Africa or to the Far East.
Van hier ging men dan verder naar Brazilië, naar Zuid-Afrika of naar het verre Indië.
At first, the Portuguese were nowhere near as hostile to the Dutch as they were to the Spanish, with whom war was waged on every possible level. As long as the Dutch promptly paid their dock dues in this old harbour office, nobody made a fuss, and they were allowed to stay as long as they wished. Besides, the Portuguese could always look forward to some attractive deals with the Dutch skippers and merchants. While they were waiting for the other ships, the Dutch could treat themselves to the local folklore, and above all, to fresh fruit and vegetables, which would keep the dreaded scurvy at bay. In the course of centuries, most of the trees were felled to repair ships, which were often badly damaged by storms when they arrived there. It never occurred to anyone to reforest the place. Only recently have attempts been made to get the island of the Green Cape green again, a seemingly impossible task. It looks as if the only thing growing here is a forest of oil drums. For a long time, the Dutch had been dreaming of the world beyond those Cape Verdean islands, of the immeasurable wealth in the heart of darkest Africa. The merchants and adventurers would go into raptures over the names of these coasts alone: Pepper Coast, Ivory Coast, and of course, the Gold Coast. In the interior of Ghana, which used to be called Gold Coast, these special gold weights are still being made, often elegantly shaped like a rider on a horse. It involves a complicated process which takes several weeks to complete. First, a wax figure is made and then covered with a thick layer of clay. For centuries, the gold from Ghana had always been transported by trading caravans through the African jungle and across the burning Sahara Desert to the north, from where it found its way to Europe across the Mediterranean. Because of these caravans, big settlements developed on the junctions of these trade routes, such as Timbuktu, where all kinds of goods were traded without a single European being involved or even present. This changed drastically when the Portuguese arrived. From then on, the black tribes could sell their gold much closer to home, on their own coast. Before 1500, the Portuguese had already founded trading posts all along that coast. For the Dutch, the toughest nut to crack on their way to Africa was the gigantic fortress of Elmina. The first Dutch fleet to attack Elmina was smashed to a pulp by the fortress's walls and cannons. It was an embarrassing disaster, and the Dutch had to slink away defeated. Yet, the Dutch didn't stop harassing and undermining the Portuguese in that vast coastal area between the White and the Black Cape. Private skippers appeared everywhere along the coast to trade in secret. The native chiefs were happy to see them come, as they were willing to pay higher prices than the Portuguese. One of these enterprising Dutchmen was a young merchant by the name of Peter van den Broeke, who would later become known as the sprightly governor of India and Batavia. In Africa, he weathered the heavy storms and sailed further south along the coastline. There he became so popular that he was personally received by the king of Luango, with whom he managed to conclude a very lucrative contract, even if he didn't understand one word of the language. Old prints show the Dutch selling their wares with great difficulty, waving hands and feet to get their message across to the females of Africa. In those days, neither Dutchman nor Portuguese would consider venturing deep into Africa, and no European had ever had the opportunity to see how the gold weights were made. The Portuguese had rather prematurely named their headquarters St. George d'Elmina, or St. George of the Mine, giving the impression that they owned the gold mines themselves. This was far from the truth. They were totally dependent on the black middlemen, who bought the gold dust from the natives who got it from deposits hidden deep in the jungle. Even these middlemen didn't know the whereabouts of these secret gold mines. These days, the gold weights are cast out of old locks, bolts and nuts, any metal that will smelt. Meanwhile, the wax figure in the ball of clay has melted due to the heat, leaving a kind of mould. This mould is then wrapped in more clay, together with the metal objects, so placing the pieces of metal on top of the hole in the mould. The whole thing is then placed into an oven and heated until the metal melts and runs into the mould. While the gold dust kept coming out of the African jungle, the Dutch were trying to get a foothold on the African coast. And in the course of this, many lost their lives during the innumerable unsuccessful attempts to drive the Portuguese out of their forts and trading posts. Especially Fort Elmina remained an obstacle in the way of the Dutch gold fever. In 1611, all independent skippers addressed a plea for help to the Dutch government. They only managed to get 5 ships, not enough to win a war against Elmina. Instead, they conquered the small town of Maure, 15 kilometers further on. This became the first Dutch base on the African shore, and a gigantic bastion called Fort Nassau was built. Thanks to this fortress, the gold trade began to flourish. So much so that in a short time, 80% of all Dutch coins were made of gold from Ghana. However, Fort Nassau was certainly not enough to put an end to the Portuguese power on the Gold Coast. There was always Elmina standing in the way of progress. A new offensive was launched in 1625. 1,400 Dutchmen landed near the Portuguese castle. While they were marching towards it, they got very hot and started looking for fruit and water. The Portuguese had put a price on every Dutch head, and so the African headhunters enthusiastically went to work. 450 sweaty Dutchmen were beheaded before they knew what was happening. The rest made a lucky escape. While the headhunters were too busy robbing the bodies of their clothes and shoes, they managed to get back to their ships. The news of this shameful defeat came as a blow to West Indian House, the Amsterdam headquarters of the newly founded West Indian Company, which had initiated the expedition. On the other side of the ocean, things were going much better for the young company. In Manhattan, they were busily building Fort Amsterdam, and in West Indian House, plans were hatched for a successful conquest of the richest sugar province of Brazil. The 19 gentlemen placed their Brazilian conquest of 1637 under the command of the dynamic Count Johann Maurits. This man needed slaves for his sugar plantations, so it was he who eventually solved the African problem for the 19 gentlemen. As soon as he heard about a weak spot in the defense of Elmina, he sent a strong fleet straight from Recife across the ocean. This weak spot was an undefended hill just behind Elmina Castle, and it was where the Dutch positioned their cannons. After a long bombardment, the Portuguese finally panicked and fled. At last the Dutch could cross the drawbridge and ensconce themselves within the walls of this enormous castle. Now the time had come for serious planning. One Portuguese fortress after another was conquered until in 1642 the last stronghold, Fort São Antonio in Axim, had fallen. In 5 years, the Dutch had completely eliminated the Portuguese from these shores.
De Portugezen van deze kust weggevaagd.
After the devastating bombardment, there was a lot of repair work to be done on Elmina. The entire castle was given a drastic overhaul. It was strengthened and extended, and of course decorated with the Dutch lion. From that moment on, the Dutch red, white and blue was flying from countless fortresses between the White and the Black Cape. Hollandia, Oranje, Aardenburg, Bartenstein, Leidsarmheid and many others. But most important of all was Elmina. The Dutch were determined not to make the same mistake as the Portuguese, so they immediately built a second fortress on top of the hill which had been the weak spot in Elmina's defense. Its name, Fort Koenraadsburg, means courage, and the chartered West Indian Company's coat of arms stood proudly over the entrance. Apart from being very solid, the fortress was also attractive. It had a charming courtyard from where a typically Dutch double staircase led to the fort commander's quarters. This comfortable atmosphere was undoubtedly necessary. The Dutch were practically imprisoned there, while all they could do was trade. In fact, their authority reached only as far as their guns. Thanks to Fort Koenraadsburg, Elmina had become an impregnable bastion and could therefore develop into the center of all Dutch trading activities in Africa. And so, next to Elmina, a small Dutch town arose. In a short period, more than 1,000 houses were built. It was called the Negerijen. It had a very mixed population of between 12 and 15,000 people. Merchants, soldiers, 600 slaves, tradesmen, fishermen and a parson. According to all the reports, it was a filthy, disease-ridden town, as most inhabitants relieved themselves wherever it pleased them, and they didn't think twice about letting their fish dry in the streets for several days, which produced a foul and unbearable stench. From the moment Johan Maurits had conquered Elmina, the Dutch embarked on the slave trade. Before then, they had hardly shown any interest in it. When they had captured a Portuguese slave vessel at sea, they would usually just let it go again. And one time, they simply released a load of captured slaves in the town center of Middelburg because they didn't know what else to do with them. This changed drastically when the new colony needed manpower and money could be earned with Africans. What kind of being was the African anyway? In the eyes of most Europeans, he was above all black, ugly and dirty. Only artists like Rembrandt and Eekhout would depict him as a human being, in accordance with the myth of the noble savage, a pure and genuine product of nature. Everybody else talked of the inferior Negro, a wicked and unreliable character. It was a miracle if one happened to come across a sincere and faithful specimen. Moral objections against slavery were hardly ever uttered as long as mercenary interests were at stake. This was also due to the fact that the clergy kept surprisingly quiet. They mainly carried on complicated debates on whether a Negro should be considered human or animal, and if so, what kind of animal. In the eyes of the slave trader, he was mere merchandise, and that is how he was judged. He had to be in good shape, with sound teeth, healthy hair, without a film over the eyes, and in possession of all his limbs. Of all African slaves, the ones from Angola were considered superior, less lazy, more willing, and above all stronger. This is the reason Johan Maurits sent a special expedition to conquer Luanda, where he set up a kind of slave pipeline straight to Brazil. In those days, a total of 13 million slaves were deported from Africa. 15 million by the Arabs from Eastern Africa. Another 15 million from the west coast by the Europeans, Portuguese, English, French, Swedes. Of these 15 million, the Dutch accounted for about 5%. In other words, 750,000 slaves. A kind of triangular trade line developed. Ships would sail from Holland to Africa. Their goods were exchanged for slaves, who were then taken to Brazil, Curaçao, and North America. From there, barter goods were returned to Holland. In Amsterdam, sugar, tobacco, and all the other merchandise filled the big warehouses which the West Indian Company was still having built in the early 1640s. Because the part of the triangle where the slaves were traded was somewhere far away, on both sides of a distant ocean, the average Dutch person never knew that he partly owed his prosperity to slavery. Until 1647, this building was frequented by famous admirals like Marten Tromp, Johan van Waalbeek and Piet Hein. This was the most turbulent as well as the most successful period in the entire existence of the West Indian Company. But after the loss of Brazil, things went downhill. Through lack of money, the 19 gentlemen could no longer even pay the rent of this building, and they were forced to retreat into their warehouses. And later, in 1667, when Manhattan was overrun by the English, the West Indian Company had lost its property in North America as well.
Manhattan door de Engelsen onder de voet gelopen en was de West-Indische Compagnie ook hun bezittingen in Noord-Amerika kwijt.
On the west coast of Africa, too, the West Indian Company lost some of their fortresses to the English. This was the last straw for the 19 gentlemen and the government. It heralded the beginning of the Second Dutch-English War. In order to recover the fortresses in Africa, the 19 gentlemen eventually managed to convince the government to call in the help of the formidable Michiel de Ruyter, whose fleet was causing havoc in the Mediterranean at the time. Michiel de Ruyter was to deliver many a painful blow to the British pride. He immediately sailed to Africa to liberate Sierra Leone, where the English had the audacity to keep 3 Dutch women as slaves. Later, he settled the war once and for all in his favor by sailing straight through the famous chains across the Thames, which caused panic and indignation in London. One member of Parliament is known to have shouted, "By God, I believe the devil is shitting Dutchmen." But Michiel de Ruyter wasn't satisfied with the recapture of Sierra Leone, and soon his admiral's ship was heading for the British fortification of Cormentine, which was conquered immediately and renamed Fort Amsterdam. This gigantic Fort Amsterdam became the new center of revitalized trading activities for the West Indian Company. It didn't take long before a rich convoy of fully loaded trade vessels could sail back home. Michiel de Ruyter personally chased it through the British blockade in front of the home ports, another of his acts of bravado which made British blood boil. Around all the Dutch fortresses, the slave trade began to flourish once again. The West Indian Company had lost Brazil and North America as a result of their parsimoniousness and sloppy administration, but the slave trade was positively booming. The whole of the West Indies had been changed over to sugar production, and Curaçao had become the pulsating heart of the slave trade on that side of the ocean. The desire for slaves was insatiable, and they could only be supplied by West Africa. The vast African continent was home to hundreds of tribes who were as different from one another as the Spanish and the English, or Norwegians and Turks, even if they were all Europeans. Like the Europeans, the African nations too were constantly fighting each other. The interior of Ghana, for instance, was inhabited by the Ashanti, the tribe of gold diggers, metal workers and tradesmen. Today, they still manufacture furniture in the same artistic way as in the old days. The Ashanti were renowned warriors too, and just like the other tribes, they were very keen on taking captives, who could then be sold as slaves to the Europeans. When the Europeans eventually introduced firearms to Africa, the tribal wars became especially atrocious and bloody, and taking captives became increasingly easy. It would be wrong to think that the slave traders ventured into the jungle themselves to catch Negroes. By paying a handsome sum for every slave, they certainly stimulated tribes to start attacking other tribal villages out of the blue. The entire population, men, women and children, would be captured and delivered to the merchants on the coast. For the captives, this long and trying journey through the jungle, away from their home ground, was the start of an uncertain and often barbaric future. Many of them believed that at the end of the long trip they were going to be fattened up and eaten. None of them had ever seen a white man before. None of them had ever even seen the sea. Instead of being eaten, they were chased up the long staircase into the belly of the fortress. They were branded and locked up. Behind this door, 600, waiting, not knowing for what. Behind this door, 800, with barely enough food to survive. Behind this door, 1,200, chained to the wall and tightly packed together for months on end. During their long wait in these dark dungeons, many hundreds starved or suffocated. But most of all, they perished from uncertainty and homesickness. Men and women were locked up separately. The women directly underneath the governor's private quarters. These women were also aired in a separate courtyard. This courtyard was surrounded by a high gallery. Whenever it pleased him, the governor would invite his honorable guests after an appetizing meal to take a stroll around this gallery with its magnificent view of the courtyard. If the governor or his guests found one of the female slaves particularly appealing because of her charm or her mysterious eyes, she was picked out of the crowd by the servants and taken upstairs by way of a special staircase at the end of which was a hatch. This hatch provided access to the bedrooms of the governor and his guests. The young girl entering these rooms was struck by the staggering difference between these bright lights and white walls and her own dark dungeon downstairs. If the slave girl became pregnant, she was lucky, for she was released and could stay in Africa. When children were born, the white father had to pay for their upbringing. That too was a stroke of luck in the life of a slave. The few parsons in Elmina reported with utter horror how the Dutch basically occupied themselves with boozing and fornication. And it didn't take long before half of the local population consisted of mulattoes. One of the few who didn't much care for the native women was a young poet. He wrote, "I find black women and mulattoes so obnoxious, so desperately base, and so appallingly hideous, that even if I were a dog, I would not want to piss against them." The majority displayed quite a different attitude, however. The debauchery was such that doctors had to work overtime treating venereal disease. The end of the long wait would come when a ship arrived at Elmina, and the governor stepped onto the balcony to oversee the departure of his slaves. This balcony looked out onto the former Portuguese church, which had been totally stripped inside and was now used as an indoor slave market. For many months, the slaves had been locked up here. Bound to each other with chains that were fixed to rings in the walls. Now they were unchained. One by one. They were driven out of their dark dungeon. Outside. Into the light. Never in their lives had they seen such a ship. They mainly got to know the hold, however, where they were packed like sardines in a tin. 15% would die during the voyage, often because they literally wasted away with grief. Sometimes calamities occurred. Once, for instance, one of the ships sprang a leak during a heavy gale off the coast of Guyana. To prevent panic, the crew was ordered to nail up the hatches of the slaves' holds. And while they were waiting many days for the wind to calm so that they could get into the lifeboats, they heard beneath their feet, in the leaking holds, 700 slaves slowly drowning. One officer who was present when a shipload of slaves reached the other side wrote, "The whole thing seemed to me such a soulless gathering of zombies, such a carnal house of skin and bone that it reminded me of the Last Judgment. These creatures can only be compared with wandering skeletons in brown leather upholstery." They were examined and sold. Then followed the hard labor on the plantations, where the slightest offense would result in the death penalty. A better fate lay in store for those male and female slaves who, for their pretty face or lighter skin, would be chosen as domestic slaves. The nanny and the Uncle Tom, the seamstress and the butler, whose life was determined by the whims and moods of the mistresses. It also meant lighter work, better accommodation, and occasional merriness in the servants' quarters. Partly as a result of the Dutch slavery, half of the present population of North and South America are descended from the African Negroes. In Elmina Castle, the Dutch had their own church, with their own parson preaching his own Christian message every Sunday. The message was one of pious devotion, brotherhood, humanitarianism. In Africa, it was easy to build up a career, if you managed to survive, that is. The Dutch had a hard time with the murderous climate, tropical diseases, alcohol and boredom. Out of the 200 or 300 company officers running the Gold Coast, at least 50 died every year. They definitely left traces there. Black families in Elmina have typically Dutch names, like Joost, De Leeuw, Vroom, Van der Puije and Smeets. On the Dutch cemetery rests Karel Bartels, councillor, judge and merchant, underneath a stone which was erected here in his memory by all his children and grandchildren together, of whom he was the White Father. An oppressive silence now hangs over Elmina Castle, an emptiness, and the roaming echoes of thousands of voices. Voices of guards and prisoners, of whites and blacks, of masters and slaves.
Bijna 250 jaar lang.
For almost 250 years, the Dutch managed to maintain their position in Elmina Castle. From their forts and castles, they dominated the entire west coast of Africa between the White and the Black Cape. But in 1872, it was finished. Trade had diminished, slavery had been abolished, and there were no longer profits to be made. The Dutch properties, as they were known in those days, were exchanged with the English for the recognition of the Dutch rights on Siak and Aceh in Indonesia. And on April the 6th, 1872, the Dutch flag was lowered here for the very last time.
In Noord-Sumatra, in Indonesië. En op 6 april 1872 werd hier de Nederlandse vlag voor het laatst gestreken.
More than 100 years ago, the last slave trader vanished from these shores. The blood, sweat and tears are a thing of the past. Anyone visiting these parts today is welcomed with dazzling hospitality, as if nothing has happened.